My name is Naomi Castellano. I am 34 years old. 2 Saturdays ago, I sat in the third row of a wedding ceremony in a navy silk dress I had bought for the occasion, holding a small black notebook in my lap that had nothing to do with the wedding at all. My ex-husband stood at the altar in a charcoal suit, glancing at me every few minutes with a smile he was working very hard to hold in place. He thought I was still sleeping on my sister's pull-out couch. He thought I still owed 3 months of back rent and a car payment I couldn't make. He had invited me to his wedding to watch him win. He did not know that the venue he had chosen, the very tent he was standing under, had a name on a private client file sitting in my work bag in the parking lot. And he did not know that in 40 minutes, when the DJ paused for toasts, a phone call I had scheduled 3 days earlier was going to ring through to the venue's payment processor and freeze every transaction tied to that wedding, live, in front of 210 guests. He thought this was his day. What he did not know was that I had spent 4 months building the report that was about to end it. Welcome back to Calm Karma Stories, where ordinary people face impossible family moments and walk out with their dignity intact. If you've ever been counted out, written off, or invited somewhere just so someone could watch you lose, this one is for you. Drop a comment and be sure to subscribe. But let me back up. Because to understand what happened in that tent, you have to understand what happened 3 years before it. In a courtroom, in a leasing office, and in a storage unit that used to hold my whole life. I met Grant Wexler when I was 26 at a conference for hospitality vendors in Charlotte. I was 2 years into my career doing compliance audits for regional event insurers. The boring, unglamorous work of reading contracts nobody else wants to read. Checking whether a caterer's liability policy actually covers what the caterer claims it covers, whether a venue's fire code paperwork is real or forged, whether the numbers in a client's books match the numbers in their bank statements. It is not romantic work, but it is precise work, and precision was the thing I built my whole identity around, because I grew up in a house where nothing was precise. My mother kept 2 sets of numbers for everything, one for my father, one for the truth. I decided very young that I would rather be alone with the truth than comfortable with a lie, and that decision shaped every choice I made afterward, including, eventually, the choice to marry Grant. Grant worked in event operations, banquets, weddings, corporate galas, and he had a gift that I mistook for years for warmth. He remembered names. He remembered anniversaries. He could walk into a room of strangers and leave it thinking he was the most generous man they'd ever met. What I did not understand yet, at 26, sitting across from him at a hotel bar in Charlotte while he ordered me a drink I hadn't asked for, was that charm like that is often a system for getting things. And I was, for the first 4 years of our marriage, one of the things it got. I have one small habit that has followed me my whole adult life, through the divorce, through the 2 years I don't like to talk about, and into the life I've rebuilt now. I drink my coffee black, with exactly 1 cube of sugar, never 2, never a packet, always a cube, because my grandmother kept a sugar bowl with cubes in it on her kitchen table, and it was the only steady, unchanging thing in a house that otherwise changed its rules every day depending on who was angry. When things get hard, I make coffee, and I drop in 1 cube, and I watch it dissolve, and I remind myself that some things still behave exactly the way you expect them to. I had a cup in my hand the morning my divorce was finalized. I had a cup in my hand the morning I opened the file on this wedding and saw Grant's name on the vendor contract. Some things are constant. The sugar cube is mine. I remember the morning the divorce was finalized more clearly than almost any other day in that period, because it was so anticlimactic, it felt almost cruel. There was no dramatic hearing, no final speech. My attorney called at 9:15 to say the judge had signed off, and I hung up, made coffee, dropped in 1 cube of sugar, and sat at Renata's kitchen table watching it dissolve, thinking that 6 years of my life had just ended with a phone call that lasted 90 seconds. I did not cry. I remember being almost unsettled by how little I felt in that moment, until I understood, a few weeks later, that the grief had simply arrived on its own schedule. Not on the day the marriage legally ended, but months earlier, the night I found the second account, when the marriage actually ended and nobody had told the calendar yet. Grant's family had a phrase they used constantly, the way some families use a prayer before dinner. His mother, Deborah, said it more than anyone. Family takes care of family. She said it the first time I met her when she asked whether I'd be willing to help pay down Grant's truck loan since I made good money now. She said it again 2 years later when Grant lost his job at a hotel group after a dispute the family never fully explained to me, and I covered 4 months of our mortgage alone while he figured things out. And she said it a third time, the week before our divorce was finalized, when she called me. Not Grant, me, to ask if I'd sign over my half of a shared investment account for the family's sake, because Grant needed it more than I did. Family takes care of family. I have come to understand that phrase as a diagnostic tool. In healthy families, it means something. In Grant's family, it was a withdrawal slip, and I was the only account anyone ever drew from. It helps to understand the shape of that family before I go further. Grant was the youngest of 3, and the only son in a household where his 2 older sisters had, by their own accounts, spent their childhoods absorbing every consequence so Grant never had to. Meredith once told me, back when we were still close, that growing up, nothing was ever really Grant's fault. It just became somebody else's job to fix. I remember thinking, at the time, that she meant it as a warning. I did not understand until years later that she meant it as a description of exactly what my marriage was about to become. For 6 years, I was the one who fixed things. When Grant overspent on a boat he couldn't afford, I renegotiated the loan. When his sister's restaurant needed a compliance audit before opening, the actual work I do for a living, given away for free because you already know how, it won't take you long. I did it in a weekend, unpaid, while also working my regular caseload. When Grant's father needed a co-signer for a business line of credit, I was the one they asked, not because I had the most money in the family, but because I was the one who would say yes and not make anyone feel bad about it afterward. I want to be clear about something, because I think a lot of people who are watching this recognize themselves in it. Being the fixer is not a compliment. It is a role assigned to the person least likely to complain. I did not choose that role. It was handed to me, quietly, over and over, until refusing it would have looked like the crime. The moment I actually decided to file, though, had nothing to do with money. It happened on a Tuesday, 6 weeks after I found the second account. At a family dinner, Deborah hosted to celebrate Grant's promotion at the venue company. A promotion, I'd later learn from the audit, that came with expanded authority over vendor payments, which is precisely the authority he used to set up BW Event Solutions 11 months later. At that dinner, Deborah raised a toast and said, looking directly at me, "To family that always shows up, no matter what." Grant squeezed my hand under the table, and for one terrible second, I almost believed the moment was sincere. Then his mother added, lightly, as if it were a joke, "Naomi especially. She'll fix anything. God love her, even things she probably shouldn't have to." The table laughed. I smiled, because that was still, at that point, the only tool I had. But I remember sitting there with a fork in my hand, doing the math on what her sentence actually meant. They knew. They knew the things they were asking of me were not reasonable, and they had decided to say it out loud, warmly, as praise, rather than change anything about what they asked. I filed the paperwork 9 days later. The marriage ended the way most marriages don't end in movies. Not with a scream, but with a spreadsheet. I found it by accident, doing what I do for a living, which is read documents other people hope nobody reads closely. I was helping Grant organize his files, his words, because he'd been asked by our accountant to produce 3 years of statements ahead of a joint tax filing. And among the PDFs was a second checking account. Not a hidden affair, not at first, just money. About $61,000 moved out of our joint savings over 18 months, in amounts small enough that I hadn't flagged them on our monthly reconciliation, which, in hindsight, is exactly the amount someone chooses when they know their spouse audits things for a living and they need to stay under the threshold where she'd notice. $61,000. I found it on a Tuesday night in March, at our kitchen table, with a cup of coffee going cold beside my laptop, 1 sugar cube sitting undissolved at the bottom because I'd forgotten to stir it. The money had gone to 2 places. The first was a woman named Priya, a coordinator at the same venue company Grant worked for, who I would later learn he'd been seeing for almost a year. The second was his mother, Deborah, $11,000 over the same period, transferred in round numbers, with no memo, no loan agreement, nothing on paper. When I asked Grant about it, he didn't deny the money, he said, and I remember this sentence precisely because it was the moment I understood exactly who I had married. You make more than me. It evens out. As if marriage were a ledger, he was allowed to balance in secret, using my own signature line as collateral. I want to give you a few of the smaller scenes first, because it was never one dramatic betrayal. It was 100 small ones, each easy to explain away on its own. There was the Thanksgiving Grant's father asked me, mid-dinner, in front of 12 relatives, whether I could take a look at the restaurant's books this week, referring to his own struggling steakhouse, because you do this professionally. It wouldn't cost us anything. I said yes, because saying no in that dining room would have required a kind of confrontation I had not yet learned how to have. I spent 4 unpaid evenings that December finding $41,000 in undocumented cash tips that should have been reported and weren't, which I flagged as a liability risk, not a favor. Advice they ignored completely and then blamed me for 18 months later when the state audited them anyway and the penalty came due. There was the spring Grant's sister, Meredith, needed a co-signer for a car lease after her second bankruptcy filing, and Deborah called me directly instead of asking Grant, because, in her words, Grant's credit isn't as strong as yours, and honestly, it's just faster this way, I signed. Meredith missed 4 payments in the first year. I covered 2 of them quietly, out of my own account, specifically so the missed payments wouldn't appear on my credit report as a co-signer default, protecting a credit score that, at the time, I still believed was something Grant's family valued about me, rather than something they simply intended to use. There was the Christmas Eve Grant told his entire extended family, as an affectionate joke, that I was basically the family's unpaid CFO, and everyone laughed, and I laughed too, because the alternative, saying out loud that I was tired, that I had a full caseload of my own clients and a marriage that increasingly felt like a second, unpaid one, would have made me the person who ruined Christmas. I want to be honest that I let that joke land as a compliment for longer than I should have. It took years to understand that being called useful, constantly, by people who never once asked what I needed, was not the same thing as being valued. And there was the specific afternoon, about 8 months before I found the second account, when I asked Grant directly whether he was happy, whether something had shifted between us, because I could feel it the way you feel a structural crack before you can see it. He told me I was always looking for a problem to solve, which I now understand was not an answer. It was a redirection, delivered by someone who had already started building a second life and needed me focused on spreadsheets instead of on him. I want to pause here, because this is the part that's hard to admit. I did not leave immediately. I stayed 4 more months, because I kept thinking there was a version of this where I had simply misunderstood something, where the numbers meant something less damning than what they obviously meant. I am good at reading documents. I am not always good at reading my own life. It took Grant's mother calling me a 5th time. This time, not for money, but to ask whether I'd be attending Priya's baby shower, because it would mean a lot to Grant if we could all still be family. For me to understand that in that household, family was not a bond. It was a resource, and I had simply been the most reliable one. I filed for divorce in September. What happened over the following 14 months is the part of this story I don't tell many people because it doesn't make me look competent, and competence has always been the thing I use instead of armor. During the divorce proceedings, Grant's attorney, paid for, I later learned, partly with money quietly routed through his mother's account, argued that the joint accounts, the ones he'd drained, should be treated as marital debt that I should share responsibility for repaying, on the theory that I'd benefited from the lifestyle those withdrawals funded. It was a strategy, not a truth, but strategies cost money to fight, and lawyers do not work for free while you wait for a judge's calendar to open up. I liquidated my retirement account to cover legal fees. I sold my car. When my lease ended that January and my new landlord ran a credit check, my score had cratered. Not from anything I'd done, but from 2 credit cards Grant had opened in our joint name years earlier that had gone unpaid the moment he moved out. Cards I hadn't known existed until the collections letters started arriving at an apartment I no longer lived in because he'd changed the mailing address without telling me. For about 5 months, I stayed on my sister Renata's pull-out couch in her 1-bedroom apartment, working my caseload from her kitchen table, taking client calls in her building's stairwell so her roommate could sleep. I am not going to pretend that period was anything other than what it was. It was humiliating in a very specific, very quiet way. The humiliation of being extremely competent at your job and completely unable to fix your own life with that same competence, because the thing breaking was not a spreadsheet. It was trust, and trust does not reconcile the way a ledger does. I kept a folded index card in my wallet during those months with 3 numbers written on it in pen. The balance I needed to clear on the first fraudulent card, the balance on the second, and the score I needed to reach before any landlord would consider me without a cosigner. I updated those numbers by hand every payday, sitting on Renata's couch after she'd gone to bed, because watching a number shrink, even by $11, even by $40, was the only proof I had, some weeks, that the life I was rebuilding was actually moving forward and not just standing still while I exhausted myself. Renata never once asked me to pay her back for the groceries, the gas money, the nights she covered my share of a bill without mentioning it. I want to say clearly, because this story is mostly about the family that used me, that there was also a family member who simply, quietly, without ever once saying, "Family takes care of family," did exactly that. She never asked for a spreadsheet. She never needed one. That distinction is, I think, the entire difference between love and leverage. There was one week, about 3 months into staying with her, when both fraudulent cards sent their accounts to a collections agency in the same 72 hours, and the agency's calls came in back to back, 6 a day, to a phone number I couldn't afford to change. I remember sitting in Renata's stairwell, agency representative on one line, a client waiting on the other, thinking, with the specific clarity that only exhaustion produces, that I now understood exactly how ordinary, careful people end up drowning in debt that was never theirs to begin with. Not through recklessness, but through someone else's decision, made quietly, months earlier, that their name was simply a resource to be used. Here is the detail that matters for everything that comes later. During that period, Grant told people I was homeless, not going through a hard time, not staying with her sister while she gets back on her feet. Homeless. He said it to his mother, who said it to his sister, who said it, eventually, to mutual friends at a wedding shower I wasn't invited to. I know this because one of those friends, a woman named Carla, who I'd stayed close with despite everything, called me crying, furious on my behalf, and told me exactly what had been said. Grant needed a story that explained why the divorce had gone the way it had. And "my ex-wife is homeless because she couldn't handle real life without me" was a much better story, for him, than the truth, which was that he had drained our accounts to fund an affair and a payment to his mother, and I had been left holding legal bills for a fight I never started. I did not correct the story. I did not post anything, call anyone, defend myself publicly. I did the only thing I have ever known how to do when the ground moves under me. I went back to the numbers. I rebuilt my credit line by line. I picked up every audit contract I could find, including 2 that required me to travel out of state for weeks at a time, sleeping in extended stay hotels I paid for with per diem money, because per diem money doesn't show up on a credit report as debt. Within 14 months, I had paid off both fraudulent cards, rebuilt my score by 90 points, and signed a lease on a 1-bedroom apartment under my own name, with my own income, with nobody's signature but mine on the paperwork. Within 2 years, I had built enough of a reputation in event industry compliance work that a national underwriting firm, the kind of company that insures banquet halls, wedding venues, and event companies against fraud and liability claims, hired me full-time as a senior forensic auditor. The interview process took 6 weeks and 3 rounds, and in the final round, the hiring partner asked me directly why I'd left independent consulting for a staff position with less flexibility. I told her the truth, that I had spent 2 years building a career entirely on my own signature, with no one else's name attached to any of it, and that I wanted the next chapter of my career to be built on an institution stable enough that no single relationship could ever again put my financial life at risk. She hired me the following week. My job, now, is to be the person a company calls when the numbers at a venue stop making sense. I want you to sit with that detail for one more second, because it matters more than almost anything else in this story. By the time Grant's mother told her friends I was still struggling, I was earning more than I ever had, in a job that exists entirely because I am extremely good at finding money that people have hidden. Grant's family built their story about me on the version of my life that was 14 months out of date. They never checked whether it was still true. That mistake is the entire reason what happened at that wedding was possible. Now let me tell you how the invitation happened, because this is the part that's almost funny, in the way that only real, procedural mistakes are funny in hindsight. About 5 months ago, my firm assigned me a new case. A regional venue company called Aldermere Events, which operates banquet halls and outdoor wedding tents across 3 counties, had triggered a compliance flag with our underwriting division. Aldermere's claims ratio had spiked over 18 months. an unusual number of vendor disputes, deposit misplacements, and client complaints about being double billed for services. My job was to conduct a full financial and contractual audit of Aldermere's operations before our firm renewed their liability policy to determine whether the pattern was ordinary mismanagement or something closer to deliberate skimming. I was 3 months into that audit, working from bank statements, vendor contracts, and internal booking software logs before I ever saw a single name attached to a face. The name that kept surfacing, more than any other, in the disputed transactions was Wexler. G. Wexler, listed as operations coordinator for Aldermere's flagship venue, the Birchwood Pavilion. The person responsible for approving vendor payments, reconciling deposits, and signing off on final invoices before they were sent to clients. I did not think much of the name at first. Wexler is not an uncommon surname, and I had, by professional necessity, trained myself out of assuming anything about a case before the documents told me to. It was not until I cross-referenced payroll records with a state business license filing, routine due diligence, the kind of boring, mechanical step that has cracked open every meaningful case I've ever worked, that I saw his full legal name and his listed emergency contact. Deborah Wexler, his mother, my former mother-in-law. I sat with that for a long moment, the way you sit with a diagnosis you already suspected but hadn't confirmed. I did what any auditor with functioning ethics does when a conflict of interest surfaces mid-case. I disclosed it, formally, in writing, to my supervising partner the same afternoon. I told her I had a prior personal relationship with the subject of the audit and asked whether I should be reassigned. She reviewed the file, confirmed there was no financial relationship between us currently, no shared assets, no ongoing legal proceeding, and made the call that I would continue the audit, but that all findings, going forward, would be independently verified by a second auditor before submission. A standard oversight protocol, not a favor to anyone. I want to be honest about this because I think it's important. I did not go looking for a way to expose Grant. I was handed a case. His name happened to be on it. Everything that followed was simply me doing my job with unusually good documentation on a subject I already understood better than most. 3 weeks into the verified re-audit, an invitation arrived at my apartment. Cream cardstock, gold foil lettering, my name. Naomi Castellano, printed correctly, which told me Deborah had kept my new information somewhere, probably from a mutual friend, probably specifically so this moment could happen. Grant Wexler and Priya Anand request the honor of your presence. My ex-husband was marrying the woman whose name I'd found buried in our joint account statements 3 years earlier, at a venue whose vendor payment records I already had open on my second monitor. I called Renata that night and read her the invitation out loud. She was quiet for a second and then said, "Do you think they know?" I told her the truth. I didn't think they knew anything. I thought they'd invited me because they wanted an audience for a story that was 14 months out of date, and nobody in that family had bothered to update their information since. I found out exactly how out of date 3 days later from Carla, the same friend who told me about the homeless comment years earlier. She'd been at a bridal shower where Deborah, 2 glasses of Prosecco in, had told the room that inviting me was a kindness, honestly, since the poor thing still doesn't have much going on, and that Grant had specifically requested I be seated near the back, so it's not awkward for her, having to see how far he's come. Carla said Grant had told his groomsmen, as a joke, that having me there would be good for a laugh, because I'd walk in wearing whatever I could afford, and everyone would understand exactly why the marriage ended. That was the plan. Invite the fixer, now presumed broke, to watch the man she used to bail out, marry someone new in a venue too expensive for her to imagine affording. It is, I'll admit, a tidy plan. It only had one flaw. They had built it entirely on a version of me that no longer existed, and they had built it inside the one professional context where I would have complete, verified, documented visibility into every dollar moving through that day. Stay with me here, because the next part is the piece that actually built the case. Subscribe now if you haven't, because what I found 4 days before that wedding is the reason 210 guests watched a payment terminal freeze mid-reception. My audit of Aldermere events had, by that point, produced a pattern I could describe in numbers instead of suspicion, which is the only kind of evidence that has ever mattered in my line of work. Here is what the file contained, item by item, the way I would eventually present it, later, to people who needed to understand exactly what they were looking at. Item 1. 14 client deposits, ranging from $4,000 to $11,000 each, collected by the Birchwood Pavilion over the preceding 16 months and never fully reconciled against the vendor invoices they were meant to cover. In each case, the client had been told, verbally, that a portion of their deposit covered a specific vendor: florist, band, catering overage. And in each case, that vendor's own records showed a lower amount actually received, with the difference unaccounted for anywhere in Aldermere's books. Item 2. A secondary vendor account registered under an LLC called BW Event Solutions, which existed nowhere in Aldermere's official vendor directory, but which had received 11 separate payments from the venue's operating account over the same period, totaling just over $43,000. BW Event Solutions had no public business listing, no tax filings on record with the state, and no employees other than a single registered agent. That registered agent's name was Grant B. Wexler. I want to walk through the first two items a little more slowly because the way they were structured tells you exactly how deliberate this was. The 14 client deposits in Item 1 were never missing all at once, and they were never large enough, individually, to trip an automatic red flag in Aldermere's accounting software. $600 short here on a florist line, $900 short there on a catering overage. Spread across 16 months and 14 different clients, the pattern was invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically cross-referencing vendor invoices against client-facing quotes line by line, which is, not coincidentally, exactly the kind of granular reconciliation most venues never perform, and exactly the kind of granular reconciliation my job exists to perform instead. Item 2. The BW Event Solutions LLC itself had been registered 14 months earlier through an online filing service, using a business address that turned out to be a mailbox rental store 2 towns away from the venue. A detail that, on its own, would have meant very little, except that the same mailbox rental store appeared, again, as the listed address on 2 of Grant's personal credit applications, from around the same period, which told me the LLC wasn't a shell someone else had set up and roped him into. He had built it himself, from the ground up, the same quiet, patient way he'd built the second checking account years earlier during our marriage. It was, I noted in my report, a familiar architecture. He had simply scaled it up and moved it to a new account. Item 3, and this is the one that mattered most for what happened at the wedding. A signed vendor services agreement dated 11 weeks before the wedding date, in which Aldermere Events, specifically Grant, acting in his role as operations coordinator, had committed the Birchwood Pavilion's entire event day vendor payment processing to route through BW Event Solutions for administrative efficiency, a phrase that means nothing and exists only to make an unusual arrangement. Sound routine to anyone who doesn't read contracts for a living. Every band, florist, caterer, and rental company working weddings at Birchwood Pavilion for the following quarter, including Grant's own wedding, would have their payments authorized through an account that Grant personally controlled, with no independent oversight, at a moment when he had every incentive in the world to route money quietly toward himself before leaving the company, which internal. Emails I later obtained showed he was already planning to do, having accepted an offer at a competing venue group to start the following month. I found the 4th item on a Wednesday night, 48 hours before the wedding, and it is the one that stopped me for almost a full minute before I could keep reading. It was an internal email, part of the standard document production Aldermere's ownership had authorized as part of the audit, from Grant to Priya, sent 10 weeks earlier. Most of it was logistics, seating charts, a florist delivery window. But near the bottom, he'd written, making sure Naomi's invite goes out early. Mom wants her seated where she can see the head table, but not close enough to make small talk. She'll probably show up looking rough. Should be a good story for the toast. I read that sentence 3 times. Then I did what I have trained myself to do with every piece of evidence in every case I've ever worked, personal or otherwise. I did not react. I saved it to the file. I labeled it, dated it, and moved on to the next document. Evidence does not need your anger to be true. It only needs to be preserved correctly. There were 2 more items I want to walk you through, because they're the ones that turned this from an uncomfortable coincidence into an airtight report. Item 5 was a text message thread, produced as part of Aldermere's standard device audit policy for departing employees, between Grant and a groomsman named Colton, sent the week the invitations went out. Grant had written that inviting his ex was basically Mom's idea, gonna be great. Colton had asked if that was messed up. Grant had written back that she was still a disaster financially, so it was basically charity inviting her and not to worry about it. Item 6 was a spreadsheet. And I want you to appreciate the irony of this, because it was, in fact, a spreadsheet, the exact kind of document that had built my entire career, found in Grant's shared drive, titled simply Wedding Budget Final. One line item, labeled Vendor Buffer for $11,400, had no corresponding vendor name, no invoice, and no explanation, sitting in the same tab as 3 other line items that traced, unmistakably, back to the BW Event Solutions account. He had built his own wedding, in part, on the same account he was using to skim from strangers' weddings. That detail never made it into my formal report because it wasn't directly relevant to the fraud finding, but I want you to understand it because it tells you something about how thoroughly the two halves of his life, the one where he humiliated me for sport and the one where he quietly stole from his employer, had become the same account, the same spreadsheet, the same lie told twice. I should be honest with you about something else, because I think it matters for understanding what happened next. I did not build a case to humiliate Grant at his wedding. That was never the plan, and frankly, it would have been unprofessional and legally reckless to design one. What I had was an audit, already underway before the invitation ever arrived, that had identified a live pattern of deposit diversion serious enough to warrant immediate action, regardless of whose wedding it happened to intersect with. My supervising partner and I made the decision, based on the evidence, that Aldermere's ownership needed to be notified before another dollar moved through BW Event Solutions. And given that 14 additional weddings were booked at Birchwood Pavilion over the following quarter, all with deposits at risk, we could not wait for a convenient moment. The ticking clock was never about Grant's humiliation. It was about a filing deadline. Under the terms of Aldermere's insurance policy with my firm, any confirmed evidence of vendor fraud had to be reported to the underwriter within 5 business days of confirmation, or the policy's fraud notification clause would be considered breached, exposing every future client at that venue to unprotected losses. I confirmed the BW Event Solutions pattern on a Wednesday. The report was due to my supervising partner and Aldermere's ownership by 9 a.m. the following Monday. Grant's wedding was that Saturday. The clock was never symbolic. It was contractual, and it was already running before I ever put on that navy dress. I called my supervising partner, Renata Osei. No relation to my sister. An unusual coincidence we'd laughed about the day I was hired. The Thursday before the wedding, and told her everything. The conflict, the invitation, the timeline, and my recommendation. That Aldermere's ownership needed to be informed of the BW Event Solutions findings before the weekend, and that given the volume of transactions scheduled to route through that account during Saturday's event specifically, the account itself needed to be flagged for a payment hold pending Aldermere's review. I want to be precise here, because precision is the whole reason any of this worked. I did not ask for the account to be frozen because it was Grant's wedding. I asked for a temporary hold because a documented pattern of unauthorized fund diversion was scheduled to process 11 more transactions through that exact account in less than 48 hours. And every day we waited was another day of client deposits potentially disappearing into an LLC with no oversight. Aldermere's ownership, once briefed, agreed immediately. They had their own reasons to move fast. 14 deposits, remember, and their liability policy on the line. The payment hold was authorized Friday afternoon to take effect the moment Aldermere's finance team activated it remotely. Nobody decided the timing to embarrass Grant. The timing was simply whenever the fraud confirmation crossed the threshold that required action, and that threshold happened to fall 2 days before his wedding, at the exact venue where the fraud was occurring. I arrived at Birchwood Pavilion on Saturday at 4 in the afternoon in the navy dress, carrying a small clutch that held nothing but my phone, a lipstick, and a single sugar cube wrapped in a napkin, out of habit more than anything, the way some people carry a rosary. The tent itself was exactly the kind of venue our underwriting division ensures constantly. White draping, a raw oak dance floor, string lights threaded through the beams, a bar stocked well past what most couples can actually afford, which is, of course, the entire reason venues like this one end up flagged for compliance audits in the first place. I knew, standing at the entrance, exactly which vendors were owed exactly how much, which is a strange thing to know while a string quartet tunes 20 feet away from you. Deborah greeted me at the entrance to the tent with the kind of warmth reserved for people you've already decided you feel sorry for. "Naomi, you made it!" "You look," she paused, just long enough for the pause to be the point. Well, considering. I told her she looked lovely. I meant it about the dress and not much else. I was seated exactly where the email had described, visible to the head table, distant enough to be excluded from any real conversation, positioned, I understood now, as a kind of prop. I checked my phone once, briefly, under the table, at 5:58. Aldermere's finance director had confirmed by text that the hold would activate remotely at 6:20, once the day's vendor disbursement batch was queued and ready to process, which is standard timing for any evening reception. 22 minutes. I put my phone away and picked up my water glass instead, and I did not check it again until the moment it actually mattered, because there is no version of good auditing that involves staring at a clock in front of 200 people. The ceremony was lovely. In the specific, expensive way, ceremonies are lovely when nobody involved has any idea what's coming. String quartet. A floral arch that, per my file, the florist had been paid for at only 60% of the contracted rate, the remaining 40% having vanished somewhere between Aldermere's operating account and BW Event Solutions. Grant looked happy. Priya looked happy. I sat in the third row with my clutch on my lap and watched two people build a life on top of a foundation I had, professionally and unemotionally, already determined was hollow. During the reception, Grant found a moment to walk past my table, refilling a stranger's champagne glass as an excuse to linger near mine. "Glad you could make it," he said, in the tone of someone delivering a line he'd rehearsed. "I know things have been tight for you. Means a lot that you'd still come celebrate with us." I told him, honestly, that I appreciated the invitation. I did not correct anything. I have learned, in 3 years of rebuilding a life, that correcting a story out loud gives it more power than letting the facts correct it for you. He smiled, satisfied, and walked back toward the head table, entirely unaware that his mother's kindness and his own careless email had just been logged, dated, and filed as Exhibit 4 in a report due at 9 a.m. Monday morning. A report that, as of 6:15 that evening, was no longer purely theoretical, because at exactly 6:20, Aldermere's finance director, acting on the authorization my firm had issued the day before, remotely activated the payment hold on the BW Event Solutions account. It happened during the toasts. The best man was mid-sentence, something about Grant always finding a way to make things work out, when a member of the catering staff approached the head table and quietly asked to speak with the venue coordinator. I watched Grant's face as he excused himself, still smiling, still performing, walking toward the small service tent where Aldermere's on-site manager stood holding a tablet, her expression the particular blankness of someone about to deliver very bad news to someone who does not yet know how bad it is. I did not follow him. I did not need to. I already knew, because I had built the report myself, exactly what that tablet said. That the payment account scheduled to release final funds to the band, the additional catering staff hired for the evening shift, and the valet company contracted for the night had all been frozen, pending an active fraud investigation, and that under the terms of Aldermere's insurance policy, no further payments could be authorized through that account until the hold was formally reviewed. Weddings? I have learned from 3 years of auditing them for a living, run on very fragile trust. Vendors work the day of an event based on a simple, unspoken agreement. Payment clears by end of night or the day after, exactly as contracted. When that trust breaks in real time, it breaks loudly, because vendors, reasonably, do not continue working for free. Within 20 minutes, the band's manager approached the head table directly and asked, in front of roughly 40 guests standing nearest the dance floor, whether someone could confirm the second half of tonight's payment, because the account on file had just declined. The valet company, separately, informed the wedding planner that they would need to stop pulling cars until payment was confirmed, which meant, functionally, that 210 guests were about to be stranded in a parking lot at a venue that could not currently pay anyone to retrieve their vehicles. I want to ask you something here, because I think it matters more than the mechanics of what happened next. How many of you have sat in a room like that? Not necessarily a wedding, maybe a holiday table, maybe a hospital waiting room, maybe just a group chat. Watching a family member's carefully built story start to come apart in real time, and felt, underneath whatever else you were feeling, a strange, quiet relief that the truth was finally louder than the performance? That relief is not cruelty. I want to be very clear about that, for anyone who has felt guilty about it. It is simply what it feels like when years of being asked to stay quiet finally end, on their own, without you having to raise your voice at all. Grant's face, when he returned to the reception floor, had lost the performance entirely. Deborah found me at my table almost immediately. Not out of suspicion yet, just out of the family instinct that has directed every crisis toward me for a decade. "Naomi, you understand contracts," she said, gripping the back of an empty chair. "Can you look at something? The account's frozen and nobody can explain why." I told her, calmly, that I did understand contracts, professionally, and that I would be glad to look. I want to be clear that I did not offer this to perform anything. I offered it because it was, at that point, simply true, and because refusing to look at a document I already had complete legal authority to review would have been its own kind of dishonesty. I walked with her to the small office behind the catering tent where Aldermere's on-site manager, a woman named Rosalind, was on the phone with the company's finance director, visibly relieved to see anyone who might understand what was happening. I introduced myself, professionally, by my current title, and asked to see the notification. Rosalind turned the tablet toward me. It was, unsurprisingly, the automated fraud hold notice my own firm's system generates the instant a flagged account is frozen. The same notice I'd reviewed a dozen times that week in draft form, except this one had a live timestamp of 6:20 p.m. that day. I read it in full, out loud, for the room, because that is the procedurally correct thing to do when multiple parties are confused and a decision needs to be made in real time, not because I wanted an audience. The BW Event Solutions vendor account has been placed under an active fraud investigation hold, effective immediately, pending review by the underwriting carrier. No further disbursements may be authorized from this account until the hold is lifted by the reviewing auditor of record. Deborah asked, quietly, who the reviewing auditor of record was. I told her the truth, because there was no version of that moment where lying would have helped anyone, least of all me. That would be me, I said. I've been conducting a compliance audit of this venue for the past 4 months. I disclosed the conflict of interest to my supervising partner the day I learned Grant was named in the file. I did not choose the timing of this hold. The account triggered the threshold for mandatory reporting under the venue's insurance policy 2 days ago, and today was the last day I had to act on it before the report became a breach on my end, not Grant's. Rosalind, to her credit, asked the only useful question left in the room, how long the hold would take to resolve, because she still had 200 guests on her floor and a caterer asking about the second course. I told her the truth. The hold itself was immediate and would not lift tonight, under any circumstance, because it was tied to an active insurance claim, not a scheduling error. But I told her, too, that Aldermere had a standard contingency line specifically for situations like this. A company reserve account, untouched by the fraud, that ownership could authorize on the spot to cover tonight's remaining vendor balances directly and reconcile with the insurance claim afterward. That was not a kindness to Grant. It was the correct, standard next step for any venue manager in that situation, and I would have given the same answer to any client, on any night, regardless of whose wedding it was. Rosalind called Aldermere's owner directly from that office, on speaker, and within 11 minutes, the contingency authorization came through, which is the only reason the band, the valet company, and the catering staff were paid in full that night, and the only reason 210 guests eventually got their cars back before midnight. I will describe the silence in that small office the way I'd describe it in a written report, because that is the only language precise enough for it: total, sustained, and load-bearing. Deborah did not say family takes care of family. I think, for the first time in the years I'd known her, she understood there was no version of that phrase that applied to a fraud hold triggered by a state insurance filing deadline. Deborah tried once more, quieter this time, closer to pleading than to her usual instruction. Can't you just pause it? Just for tonight? Just until the honeymoon's over and then deal with it properly? I told her, as gently as the answer allowed, that a fraud hold is not something an individual auditor pauses as a favor. It exists precisely so that no single person's relationships can decide whether evidence gets acted on. I told her that if I quietly delayed a documented fraud finding because the subject happened to be my ex-husband, I would not only lose my license, I would become exactly the kind of unreliable, self-interested actor the entire audit process exists to catch. This isn't me being unwilling to help, I said. This is the report already being filed. It filed itself the moment the numbers didn't match, 3 months before this wedding was ever on my calendar. Rosalind, still holding the phone against her shoulder, asked me one more question before Grant arrived. Quietly, almost to herself, though I answered it anyway. "Did you know this would happen tonight? Specifically tonight?" I told her no, not specifically. I'd known the hold would activate sometime that weekend, once the confirmation cleared verification, but the exact evening had been decided by Aldermere's finance team's processing schedule, not by me, and certainly not by any wish to see it happen at this particular reception rather than any other. She nodded slowly, the way people do when they're deciding whether to believe something that happens to be true and convenient at the same time. I didn't try to convince her further. The timestamp on the notification would say the same thing, regardless of what either of us believed about it. Grant appeared in the doorway less than a minute later, having been told by a groomsman that I was in the back with Mom, looking at something on a tablet. I watched him process the room. His mother pale, Rosalind on the phone, me holding the tablet with the calm, procedural stillness I have spent years training into every part of my professional life. "What is this?" he said. And it wasn't really a question. I told him plainly. I told him that Aldermere's finance records showed BW Event Solutions had received $43,000 in vendor payments over 16 months with no corresponding services rendered to any documented client, that the LLC's registered agent was him, and that 14 separate client deposits, including his own wedding's remaining vendor balance, were currently unaccounted for. I told him the hold would remain in place until Aldermere's ownership and the underwriting carrier completed a formal review, which, given the volume of evidence already compiled, would very likely result in the account being closed permanently and the diverted funds referred for restitution. He said my name once, the way you say a name when you're trying to locate an old leverage point that no longer exists. "Naomi. You can fix this. You always fix things," I told him, and this is the only moment in the entire evening where I allowed myself a single sentence that wasn't purely procedural. "I'm not your fixer anymore, Grant. I'm the auditor." Then I set the tablet down on Rosalind's desk, thanked her for her patience, and walked back out to the reception. By then, word had already moved through the tent the way it always does at events like this. Not through any announcement, just through the particular electricity of 200 people noticing, all at once, that something has gone wrong behind the scenes. The band's manager was standing near the head table, explaining to the wedding planner, loudly enough for the nearest 30 guests to hear clearly, that the group would be packing up unless payment cleared within the hour. A cluster of Grant's groomsmen, Colton among them, still holding a half-finished drink, had gathered near the bar, watching Grant argue quietly with the venue's owner, who had arrived in person once Rosalind's call escalated past what she could handle alone. Priya stood alone near the cake table for almost the entire 11 minutes it took the contingency authorization to clear, her bouquet still in one hand, watching her new husband's face while he learned, in real time, exactly how the wedding he'd built to humiliate someone else had instead exposed him. I did not watch this out of any satisfaction. I want to be honest about that. I watched it the way I watch every case resolve, with the specific, quiet stillness of someone confirming that the numbers, in the end, told the truth whether or not anyone wanted them to. Carla found me near the exit as I was leaving and asked, quietly, if I was all right. I told her I was. She asked if I'd known, walking in, that this was going to happen. I told her the truth. I'd known for 4 days that a hold was coming. I had not known, until I watched Grant's face in that service tent, how much of his entire adult life had been built on exactly the same habit. Quietly moving money he hadn't earned toward a story he needed people to believe. I did not stay to watch the rest unfold. I want to be honest about that, because I think there's a version of this story where the satisfying ending is me standing in that tent watching every domino fall in real time, and that is not what happened, and I don't think it needed to happen that way for the outcome to matter. I said goodnight to Rosalind, confirmed she had my direct line for the following business day, and drove home. I made coffee. I dropped in 1 sugar cube and watched it dissolve, the way I have watched it dissolve at the end of every difficult day for 15 years, and I went to bed. Here is what happened over the following weeks, compressed the way these things always compress once the paperwork starts moving instead of the people. By Monday morning, my formal report, the one with the contractual deadline that had nothing to do with Grant's wedding and everything to do with insurance law, was filed with both my supervising partner and Aldermere's ownership. It documented all 14 items I've described, plus 3 more that surfaced during the final verification pass. 2 additional vendor accounts registered to associates of Grant's, and a pattern of Grant approving his own overtime payments for events he had not actually staffed. Aldermere's ownership terminated his employment that same day, citing cause, which under state law forfeited his eligibility for any severance and preserved the company's right to pursue restitution through civil claims. The underwriting carrier, my employer, formally opened a fraud claim against the diverted funds, which meant Aldermere's insurance would cover the 14 affected clients' deposits, but which also meant Grant now had a documented civil liability of just over $43,000, independently of whatever criminal referral the district attorney's office chose to pursue once Aldermere filed. Their police report the following week. Priya left him 9 days after the wedding. I don't know most of the details, and I made a deliberate choice not to ask Carla for them, because by that point, the story had stopped being mine to narrate. What I do know, because it appeared in the civil filing Aldermere's attorney eventually sent my firm as part of the restitution case, is that Priya's name had briefly appeared as a joint signer on one of the BW Event Solutions bank documents, an arrangement Grant had apparently set up without fully explaining what the account was for, and that her attorney moved quickly to have her name removed from any liability once the fraud was confirmed. I imagine that discovery, on top of a canceled honeymoon and a frozen joint account, was not a small thing to survive as a 2-week-old marriage. 3 weeks after the wedding, Aldermere's ownership formally filed a police report, which moved the case from a civil restitution matter into a criminal one as well. Grant was interviewed twice by detectives from the county's financial crimes unit, because BW Event Solutions had no legitimate business activity behind it. And because the pattern spanned 16 months and 14 separate client deposits, the district attorney's office ultimately charged him with theft by deception under state law, a charge that, given the dollar amount involved, carried the possibility of real jail time rather than a fine. 5 weeks after the wedding, the competing venue group that had offered Grant a new position, the job he'd been planning to move into before the fraud came to light, formally rescinded the offer, citing information that came to our attention regarding your previous employment. I did not have anything to do with that call, though I understand, from Rosalind, that Aldermere's ownership had, quite reasonably, disclosed the pending criminal matter to any employer who called for a reference. Between the 3rd and 5th week, 2 other clients whose deposits had been affected came forward on their own once Aldermere sent out the disclosure, notice my report had required under the terms of the insurance policy. Both had noticed, in hindsight, small discrepancies in their own final invoices. A florist charge that didn't match what they remembered agreeing to, a catering fee 11% higher than the contract stated, and had simply assumed, the way most people do, that they'd misremembered the numbers or misread the fine print. Neither had considered, until Aldermere's letter arrived, that the discrepancy wasn't a misunderstanding at all. It was the same pattern, applied to their wedding, the same as it had been applied to 14 others, the same as it had, in its own strange way, been applied to mine years earlier, in a joint account he thought I wasn't watching closely enough to notice. 2 months after the wedding, Grant listed the townhouse he and Priya had bought together for sale, presumably to cover mounting legal fees, and moved back in with Deborah. The same childhood bedroom, I'm told, that he'd moved out of at 22. 4 months after the wedding, the civil restitution case settled. Grant agreed to repay the full $43,000 to Aldermere's insurance carrier over a structured 5-year schedule, with a lien placed against any future earnings until the balance cleared. The criminal case was still pending the last I heard anything about it, moving through the county's backlog the way these things typically do, slowly, on its own schedule, entirely independent of anyone's forgiveness. Deborah called me 11 days after the wedding. I let it go to voicemail the first time. Not out of spite, but because I have learned that answering a call before you're ready to hold a boundary is how boundaries get eroded one exception at a time. Her message was long, and I'll paraphrase rather than repeat it verbatim, because repeating verbatim is a habit I've had to unlearn. She said the family was in crisis, that Grant was facing possible charges, that she never meant for things to go the way they went at the wedding, and that she hoped I could help him find a lawyer, since I probably knew people. Family takes care of family. Even then, even with a police report filed and her son's employment gone, that was still the frame she reached for first. I called her back 2 days later, once I'd decided exactly what I was willing to say. I told her I was glad to talk, and that I would say this once. I would not be finding Grant a lawyer. co-signing anything, or advising him informally on how to navigate a civil claim my own employer was actively pursuing against him, because doing so would be both a conflict of interest and, frankly, not my responsibility anymore. I told her I was willing to have a relationship with her, going forward, that did not involve money, favors, or being asked to manage Grant's consequences, but that any conversation that opened with what I could do for the family would end quickly. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said something I did not expect. "I don't think I ever really saw what we were doing to you until I watched you hold that tablet." I told her I appreciated her saying that. I did not tell her it changed anything about the boundary. Both things were true, and I've learned you're allowed to hold both. We have spoken twice since then, both times on my terms. A short phone call around the winter holidays, and one coffee at a shop of my choosing near my apartment rather than hers. She has not once, in either conversation, asked me to help with Grant's legal fees, his living situation, or his case. I don't know whether that's growth or simply the exhaustion of finally running out of other options. I've decided it doesn't matter which. What matters is that the boundary held both times, cleanly, without me having to raise my voice or repeat myself, because a boundary that has to be defended constantly was never actually a boundary. It was a suggestion. I stopped making suggestions the night I set that tablet down on Rosalind's desk. Here is what I've learned, and I say this directly to anyone watching who has ever been the fixer, the reliable one, the person a family calls not because they love you best, but because they know you'll say yes. Competence is not a debt you owe people. Being good at solving problems does not obligate you to solve everyone else's problems forever, especially not the ones they created by lying to you. The version of me that covered mortgages and co-signed loans and stayed quiet while my name was used to explain away someone else's failures. That version of me thought silence and generosity were the price of belonging. It took losing almost everything and rebuilding it alone, line by line, dollar by dollar, to understand that the people who only value you for what you fix were never actually keeping you. They were keeping the fixing. The moment I stopped being useful to them in the way they expected, they had nothing left to say to me, except, as it turned out, an invitation designed to watch me lose, at the exact moment I had, without their knowledge, quietly become the one person in the building whose signature controlled whether their money moved at all. I also want to say something to anyone watching who is worried that leaving the fixer role behind makes you cold or vindictive or somehow less generous than you used to be. It doesn't. I did not build that audit to hurt Grant. I built it because it was my job, and I did it carefully, ethically, and with full disclosure, exactly the way I would have handled any other case. The justice in this story was never loud, and it was never personal in the way revenge is personal. It was simply what happens when a person who spent years being underestimated quietly keeps doing good, careful work in her own name until the truth she'd been documenting all along finally had somewhere official to go. That is the only kind of justice I have ever believed in. Not the kind you chase, but the kind that arrives on its own schedule, once you've stopped spending your energy managing other people's consequences and started spending it, instead, on your own life. And to the people who invited me to that wedding, hoping I'd walk in looking defeated, I understand, now, why you needed that story to be true. It was easier than admitting what you'd actually done. But stories built on outdated information have a specific weakness. They don't hold up under a single new document. Mine didn't hold up for more than 20 minutes past 6:20 that evening. These days, my coffee still comes black, with 1 cube of sugar, watched until it dissolves, every morning, whether the day ahead is ordinary or not. Some mornings, it's just coffee. Some mornings, like the one after that wedding, it's the last steady thing I do before I go back to being exactly who I already was. The person who reads the documents nobody else wants to read, and tells the truth about what they say, calmly, one line at a time, regardless of whose name is on them. If this story meant something to you, if you've ever been the one who fixes, who covers, who stays calm while everyone around you counts on that calm to keep taking from you, tell me in the comments. Tell me what your version of the sugar cube is, the one small, steady thing you hold on to when everything else is falling apart. Share this with someone who needs to hear that competence is not obligation, and that the quietest exits are usually the ones that land the hardest. Subscribe so you don't miss the next one. I'll see you in the next one.